This is ThriveCasters,
Thriving, not surviving.
tackling youth issues that matter to you.
Welcome back to ThriveCasters. I'm your host, Waseelah, and today we're going to be talking about adverse childhood experiences in film. My guest today is Benjamin Perks, who is the Global Head of Campaigns and Advocacy at UNICEF, whose work has taken him all over the world doing some really wonderful work on issues surrounding children and education, and he joins me now from New York. Ben, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Great to be with you today.
So far here at ThriveCasters, we've been talking about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and how they relate to youth violence, which is something very common coming up in conversations and in the media a lot more. So I understand that a lot of your work, Ben, involves using ACEs to make a difference to young people in a slightly different way than how we've been discussing so far. So could you tell us a little bit more about what ACEs means for your work and for yourself?
Yeah, so I work in an organisation that supports basic services, health, education, and child protection services in almost all countries in the world, but particularly the low and middle income countries, the poorer countries. And what we're trying to do is address and reduce childhood adversity, violence, and trauma by strengthening the way that local services deal with it. And there are two really good public interventions that in recent years we've realized can really help to prevent or respond to ACEs. Mm-hmm. The first is that when parents have a first child, a newborn child, if they can receive support and guidance from the health system on how to build a healthy attachment and a loving relationship with the child, and to be aware of the way that maybe their own trauma and their own personal history can be transmitted to the child, and to work around that, to build strategies to prevent that from happening, this can prevent the intergenerational transmission of violence or neglect or other forms of adverse childhood experiences. Mm-hmm. The second thing we're really interested in is what happens when a child is affected by violence, neglect, or dysfunctional parenting at home. How can you help that child to recover so that they can build a better future? And one of the things that we're really interested in is the way that schools and communities are trauma-informed, address mental health, and that teachers can help children that may feel unloved and unsafe at home to feel that they do matter, to feel that they matter on an individual basis. And this involves the teacher making sure that all children in the classroom are safe, seen, secure, and soothed. And these are two of the major public interventions. So we're working with partners in the World Health Organization and others to really try to expand those services and make them global. I think in the middle of the COVID crisis, I think a lot of governments and people have seen the extent to which adverse childhood experiences are a really massive issue for children that now have to stay at mm-hmm. home. I think this has only shone the light on how we need to do much more to address adverse childhood experiences.
Wow. Because you mentioned trauma-informed environments. So if I were going to school tomorrow, though I haven't been to school in a long time, and I were going to school tomorrow, what would look different about my day at school than how it used to be?
I think the first thing is the environment would be calm. The teacher and the community would try to facilitate a sense of belonging where every child felt they had a place. Mm-hmm. The teacher would invest in facilitating good peer relationships. Rather than responding to bullying, violence, or misbehavior, they would try to build strong peer relationships. But most mm-hmm. importantly of all, the teacher would communicate with the child in a way that makes that child believe that they matter on an individual level. It's really hard, the classroom of 25, 30 children, but when you do speak to kids that have come from high ACE backgrounds and mm-hmm. have recovered and built a career or built a stable family, often they will tell you that the most important thing in their life was a caring teacher who made them feel like that they were important and that they could build a better future.
Right. So if as young people, so trauma-informed environments are still a new thing. They haven't really got to schools yet. What can we do as young people, if anything, to start creating that environment? Like, is there a way that we can raise awareness amongst ourselves?
Yeah, I think we need a social movement. I think we need to recognise that adverse childhood experiences and trauma in childhood is a major driver of lifelong inequality, as is poverty or discrimination. And so we need to have a movement of young people in particular to campaign against violence and neglect, and to campaign for trauma-informed schools and to support the parents. So because we're probably the first generation now that have the knowledge to really dramatically reduce this type of trauma in the lives of children. We could do a lot,
Yeah.
but we don't have political will often. So it's important that the young people use their democratic citizenship to demand better interventions, better investment on this particular area.
Yeah. So from where we sit at ThriveCasters, so when we were first approaching ACEs, so we had no idea about anything, that this conversation was even happening. So when I was looking for people to interview and things, I came across your blog where you were talking about ACEs in films and how actually ACEs are very, very commonplace, but it's been a conversation that's been happening in academia and psychology, and it hasn't been happening amongst young people. So could you tell us a little bit more about what you mean when you see ACEs in films?
Yeah, I was struck that when we watched the Oscars this year, that a significant minority of the films had a theme of childhood adversity in them. I think it was a quarter. You will remember the number that I wrote in the blog, but I think it was about a quarter, and it included the Joker. It included Judy, included Rocket Man. There was so many films that had that theme. So what was interesting was that this is a theme that the public relates to, because you make films about stories that people identify with. And to me, this is important for ACEs because everybody is affected by ACEs. There's nobody on the planet that's not affected by ACEs. If a person didn't have any ACEs themselves in childhood, right, they're already in a minority, but they're likely to be married to somebody that did, or likely to have a boss or a colleague who did, or likely to have a neighbor that did. And those ACEs affect them in some way.
Yeah.
So the fact that we know this and can talk about this in film, that ordinary people now, the taboos are now breaking in society, and ordinary people identify with this story, means that surely it's time that we also took the ACEs story more seriously in public policy and the way we run our societies and communities.
So would that be a conversation where we have like directors putting together their own films that are specifically about ACEs and are very, very aware of ACEs, as we have like lots of films about mental health now? Would ACEs be something like that, or would it be something that's more subtle and just comes up more naturally?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about, every single director that made a film like the Rocket Man, the Joker, all of those directors, they didn't have a conversation about ACEs before the film, I would guess. I think it's just that ACEs are a part of life. So organically and by themselves, it became a major driver of those scripts. I think it's not a community project where you want to make a film about mental health or violence or ACEs. It was just an organic, market driven. This is the important point. Directors make films, successful directors make films that they know will be a big hit. Artists create works, including films that people identify with. They know if people identify with the product, they will have much better box office sales. So it must have been when they write those stories, when they tell those stories, they're telling stories that people can identify with. So at that level in art, which is market driven and is responding to people's needs and the things that people feel are important in life, they're recognizing ACEs. But often our institutions, our politicians, youth forums, youth
Mhm.
organizations, non-governmental organizations. Bodies don't. They don't talk about ACEs. They talk more about poverty, about discrimination. These are very important things, but they really struggle to talk about ACEs.
Yeah, that was something that came to my mind. So when I read your blog and you were talking about Joker and things, and ACEs is always situated in a conversation around poverty, but it came to mind that somebody like Batman, he has ACEs, but Bruce Wayne, he isn't in a war zone, he isn't in poverty, he's the richest and most famous man in Gotham. But as you said, it's like everybody is involved in ACEs in one way or another, and it manifests differently, and there are lots of different facets and lots of different nuances to how ACEs appears. And I think as young people, that's quite important to acknowledge, that it's not just something that's located within, this push and this conversation about poverty.
Yeah, ACEs are really about are not about us and them. They can affect anybody. So, like, I work in an organization where we are looking across the situation of children across the world. Now, a traditional narrative will tell us that children in Syria or Yemen in a situation of conflict and poverty and dependent on humanitarian aid, and now in the midst of a COVID crisis,
Mm-hmm.
are the children who are suffering most in the world, right?
Yeah.
But I also have to recognize that if a child lives in Hampstead Garden suburb in London, or
Yeah.
here in Beverly Hills, and they are affected by incest, terrifying incest at home in a wealthy
Mm-hmm.
family, they are equally traumatized. I mean, it's a recognition that childhood trauma cuts across all societies, all social classes. There are linkages with, with more ACEs and poverty. We tend to, I think some of the research demonstrates that kids in poverty may be more likely to have multiple ACEs, but we still see children in very wealthy situations that are also having unspeakable violence and neglect or abuse in their lives. And that will on them throughout their entire lives. So
Yeah.
you're right, Batman and Joker suffered in different ways. We maybe because we're so used to talking about poverty and not used to talking about trauma, we see Joker as coming from a much more wretched situation than Batman. But they both had different types of trauma.
Yeah.
The other important thing about Joker that I have to say, and I get reminded of this all the time,
Mm-hmm.
is that Joker had multiple traumas and had terrible life outcomes and went into a cycle of crime.
Mm-hmm.
But the vast majority of people who do have adverse childhood experiences, they may be more likely to have worse life outcomes, but many of them do exceptionally well and they go on to recover and heal. And I think that's a positive story that we have to take out of ACEs.
Absolutely. It's interesting when you look at the adverse childhood experience quizzes and you look at the questionnaires and things, and something like divorce and having separated parents, it's something that I know where I'm growing up. So I have multiple heritage and I'm half Moroccan, but something like divorce, to start with, it's very shamed upon, but then people sort of look at it and just like, oh, well, it's normal, it happens to everybody, and it's not treated as if it is something that is a trauma. It's not treated as if it does affect you. And with something like that, divorce rates are going up every day. It's it's so present, it's so common, but we just sort of told to carry on. And especially as young people, we don't really know what to do with that trauma. We don't know where to go with it. So with these films and these things that, like Joker or Batman, or in my mind, I've got Harry Potter, what is it that you would say as a professional? So what is it that as young people we should be, when we're watching these films, when we're creating our own films, when we're having our conversations, what is it that we should be putting as the foundations of the conversations that we should be putting forward and telling everybody about?
I think three things. I think firstly that if you have trauma in your life, it's nothing for you to be ashamed of, right? In fact, it can be an incredible weapon of strength, like as it is with Batman or Harry Potter, right? It can
Yeah.
be something that can help to drive you forward. That's the first point. But the second point is you've got to learn how to manage it. And managing it is partially about being aware of it and being mindful that sometimes trauma in the past may affect the way that you make decisions, that you live life. And often the way to address that is through professional support or other ways of being mindful. But people mainly recover from ACEs, as far as we know at the moment, because it's a growing science, as far as we know at the moment, from having high quality relationships. So it's really important that you reach out and build networks of relationships with people, that healthy relationships with people that genuinely care about you, and that you prioritize that as as an important aspect of life. I think we've all learned through the COVID crisis that connection is one of the most valuable things we have. And the third thing is for people that may not themselves be affected by really high levels of ACEs, but may see other people who are, who are demonstrating behaviour that means that they may be in pain. And I think the important thing is maybe not to judge them for that pain, but to reach out to them and help them to feel like they belong, like they matter, and like they're a part of your community. So that's three things. And if you're affected by trauma, you're not the only one. It's normal. It's just that we don't talk about it enough, but it's completely normal. Secondly, that one of the most important ways to address trauma is to be aware of it, maybe to seek help, but definitely to have positive relationships in your life. And thirdly, as young people, look around your community and ask yourself, is anybody alone here? Is there somebody that's suffering alone, connected? Because the ACEs, what they do is they make people more likely to be alone, right? There's something in psychology called attachment theory, which shows that kids that have had, particularly with neglect or violence, if they've had really heavy neglect and violence at home, they're going to really struggle to make relationships. So help those kids to integrate in your community. Don't let your classroom or your youth group or your community be a place where any child is, young person is by themselves. You don't know what their story is. You don't know where they're coming from.
So I think with all of this as well, it's like, it's as young people, like when you're growing up anyway, you have this nervousness, and like I say this, that I'm doing my master's, but I'm still nervous every day about going to meet new people because I'm at that liminal point in my life, and you sort of don't realize when you are alone or you aren't. But I think professional support in my life has been, it's kind of a privilege. So I went to a nice university that let me have good access to professional support when I needed it. But for a lot of young people, that professional support isn't there. We've got waiting lists that are a year and a half long with the NHS, or the school doesn't have the facilities or the funding. So how do we work through our own traumas and things when we don't have the facilities, we don't have the youth clubs anymore to create the communities? How do we work through it?
Again, I think it's about building relationships and trying to. I mean, I think it's not good that youth clubs and other services have been closed down. I think we now see the cost of that in the midst of this pandemic crisis. But I think that young people, can do what young people have done throughout history, which is build their own communities and their own groups and their own networks, innovate to make that happen. And when doing that, be trauma informed, be a place where kids in need can recover and where people can help each other out. I dream that one day we will have a world where people can talk openly about trauma, they know how to manage it, and people lean in and support them when they talk about it. I think that young people can create those networks to some extent themselves.
Yeah. So essentially using creating our own trauma-informed environments amongst young people, so that is calm, it has the belonging that we want from our teachers, that we want from the youth clubs that aren't there anymore.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, right? If somebody has got a mental health problem that needs specialized support, that's something different. That requires a referral to a mental health professional. That's something completely different. But what we do know is that all people in a community are likely to do better if they are connected, particularly kids and young people who are affected by high ACEs. So it's about simply creating communities which provide belonging, provide conversation, show an interest in each other, and this is a basic human need, right? So ACEs are painful and harmful because they cut off a basic human need, right? Children are born and they seek a deep connection with a parent to be protected, to learn how to navigate the world, and to feel loved. When that relationship is absent, they interpret it as threat. It's a biological imperative.
Mm-hmm.
If communities and schools are trauma informed, they're trying to give back that connection to the child through another channel and to help them recover. And people with child trauma can recover at any age.
That's very interesting. So I was reading a book recently about sort of attachment theory in adults, and how, like, as you go through your life, your attachment changes, and the way that even if adults are hostile to you later on, that also changes. And I find it very interesting how this book didn't relate it to sort of childhood traumas. It didn't relate it to anything like that. So I think with more awareness, even as adults or as young people sort of on the cusp of being adults, having that awareness and having that knowledge, even when we're forming our own relationships, we're starting our own families and things, it would be such a big help to try and understand why we behave as we do, why do we function as a community as we do. And as like ThriveCasters is about sort of looking at youth violence, it's also how and why is there an increase in youth violence? Is there this hostility between us where we feel like we can't form communities?
Well, these you've asked about 3 questions in one question
Yeah.
there. I think that the propensity for people, right? Violence is, to me, having worked in conflict situations, having dealt with issues of criminal justice systems in different countries, violence to me is usually an interaction between 2 things. It is the ACEs and experience in childhood that increase somebody's propensity towards violence as a young adult, connected to structural changes at any given moment in society, right? So if we look throughout the whole of history, there used to be much more violence than there is today. Our communities are relatively safe compared to the way they were previously.
Absolutely.
There has been a shift, from what I can understand, in the way in some countries, including our country, in the way that criminal gangs function. They have recruited often and organized victims of trauma, right? So gangsters recruit victims of trauma to push drugs, right? Because those are the people they go after, in the same way that traffickers also go after vulnerable children. So they recruit and network kids that have got a high degree of propensity to violence, anxiety, all of that, because of where they're coming from. And then they network them and give them weapons often, or they carry weapons. And I think our police chief was saying recently that in London, principally, every drug delivery now is done by somebody under 17. That's the change, right? That's the change.
Yeah.
It's the fact that the criminal gangs may have changed. This is from what I can see. I don't believe propensity for violence has grown, because I think there's always been propensity for violence. It's the way that society manages that violence from a criminal justice perspective. But these are things that we're still beginning to learn about. So I say that with a high degree of humility, and we will learn more about these issues as the science develops. So that's about. So I don't believe that violence is increasing. I don't believe that propensity to violence is increasing. But I do feel that the police now are responding to this in many places, like I think Berkshire, in Wales, in others, where they're doing trauma-informed policing, where they're looking at a 15-year-old county lines drug trafficker and saying, is this a criminal or is this a victim, right? And they're putting in place things that prevent kids from becoming having a life cycle of crime
Mm-hmm.
before before they're doing preventative work to remove those kids at risk from the clutches of the organized criminal. And I wrote another blog on this called The Networking of Trauma, which
Yeah.
you could read.
So I think it's interesting. So you're saying that we haven't become any more violent, but the
Right.
media, and where we sit as young people, when we're looking at the media, and it's saying that there's this knife crime epidemic and things like that, like it doesn't feel like that from where we're sitting, where we're looking at it and saying, well, like what's happening to our young people? What's changing? Why is it changing? So I think you make some really interesting points there that actually, just the nature of how we interact and how we, our propensity to violence, it hasn't changed, but how we are being violent and the different forms of violence are the things that are changing.
Yeah, I think so. And these things are also more visible, I guess. I mean, I first see that there is one of America's top public intellectuals, Steven Pinker, wrote a huge piece of work a few years ago in which he charted the progress of violence over many centuries and until the modern time.
Mm-hmm.
And there's clearly a decline in violence because the way that important point I make about the way that society and the state manages violence. So if you imagine just a few decades ago, or we didn't have the criminal justice system that we have now. We
Mm-hmm.
didn't have the opportunities that we have now. We didn't. There were many. We forget this because we come from a position of complacency in the modern world. But there are now measures in place to prevent violence that didn't exist in previous ages. So the violence has continuously declined. When I was a kid, which is a few decades ago, we lived in incredibly violent urban, inner city lives in the UK, when probably more people were involved in violence. There wasn't so much use of knives or guns, but more people were involved in casual violence. And I think that it's just that violence is often obviously sensationalized. Also, new forms of violence, right? So the knife, the use of knives has increased massively. And I think also the online violence. So what we've seen globally is an increase in violence amongst girls because a lot of the non-physical forms of violence are more, lend themselves to the online world. So we see increasing online violence as well.
So as you work in a very international space, like are there other countries and other places that are doing things that are sort of tackling this youth violence and tackling the new violence that we have?
Yes, they are. I mean, there are multiple countries that are trying new ways of tackling these issues. But I think what's changed is the nature to which the psychology of violence, the trauma-informed approach, is spreading and growing. I think that's one of the things that's changed, and that's happening all over the world. There are different ways that. There have been over the past 2 or 3 decades different ways in which communities have addressed different forms of violence. So if you look at South Africa, there was a huge challenge in South Africa of healing the collective trauma from the state violence that had existed in the apartheid regime.
Mm-hmm.
So truth and reconciliation, by having an open conversation across all of the affected communities about what had gone on before, how we could collectively interpret it, and how we could build a better society for the future, probably stop that country from going into a much greater state of violence.
Yeah. So would you consider that to be a trauma-informed environment in itself in South Africa?
Well, I mean, it can only be a trauma-informed environment when all of the services in place, when all of the schools and health systems and the social work systems and everything else also practice trauma-informed approaches. So I think it is an example of one good dimension of a process that had a good contribution. But I think that you need to have a dense network of communities and services that are also practicing trauma-informed support to have a truly trauma-informed system.
So from where we sit as young people, so would that be us being informed, our parents being informed, and our teachers being informed about all of these issues, no matter how complex they are, and then using that, I guess, in a smaller way to South Africa, because we don't really have apartheid here, and using that as our way to get through, communicate ACEs, and overcome our own traumas?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what that's what we have. I think the power to do. We have the first generation, that have the knowledge and capability to make that a reality. The analogy that I would use is that, several decades ago, a group of people believed that serious diseases like smallpox and polio and those diseases could not be stopped, right? Children were going to die of those diseases. Whatever you did, there's nothing you could do to stop them, right? And then people started to look at delivery systems to vaccinate every child in a community against a disease. And then what we learned, and it's very interesting in the COVID crisis, was that people had herd immunity. We developed herd immunity, which meant the disease could not reproduce, right? That's because at that time in history, we had that knowledge about public health and epidemiology. Today, we have knowledge about psychology and neurobiology that enables us to see that if we could create societies where we could try to tackle trauma across communities, then so I think that if we could get health systems, education systems, social work systems, police systems, youth organizations, civil society, political institutions, all to become trauma informed. And if we invest in supporting parents to ensure nurturing caregiving of every child, with those interventions, we could reduce trauma in society, possibly the same way that we've dramatically reduced child death because of childhood disease in previous generations.
So an awareness of ACEs would effectively be like a vaccination, a way that we can prevent, a way that we can have a healthier society overall.
Yes, I think so. Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's based on what we know at the moment. We could, the only vaccination we have against child trauma or ACEs and all of the life outcome, negative life outcomes, is to be trauma informed and to promote nurturing caregiving. That will be our only vaccine.
That's such a a nice final thought. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Ben, and taking your time in this crazy time that is Corona time to come and talk to us. To our listeners, you've been listening to ThriveCasters with me, Waseelah, and my guest, Ben Perks, talking about adverse childhood experiences in film. Join us next time for more conversations on how to thrive and not just survive. Don't forget to follow us on social media at onpointwm and #ThriveCasters. Join us next time for more conversations that matter to you.